Great. Looks like we've got our panel together here with Greer as well joining us. So thanks everybody. We're also going to hopefully see the Slido questions start to be repopulated with some of the questions that were carried over from earlier talks, as well as invite everybody who's listening to please be sure to pose additional questions that you feel might have sort of a broad interest to kind of bring to the discussion for the final time of our workshop. So let's see. I'm reading quickly as we go here. I'm gonna because we've got Devin sort of on the hot spot. His brain is churning here. There's a question, Devin, with this just in natural resources. It sounds like a very effective program. Do you have any advice for other First Nations groups looking to build similar programs in their communities?
Yes, definitely. So I think, as I said in my talk, the key for us to be so effective so quickly was these long-standing working relationships that we have with government agencies and consultants. But for us, I mean, we really had to sit down and consider what our big risks were, and that kind of guided us to who we would be looking to bring onto the project. Because I mean, ultimately, the communities, especially in BC, I'm not sure about the States and how your referral process is set up, but through our referral process in BC, just about any project going on in the watershed comes through this office. So there's really no one better suited to help coordinate and build efficiencies on projects with groups that may have similar interests, and also kind of stop parallel processes before they get too far down the road and you kind of have two projects going side by side at the same time. So if I were to give one piece of advice, if those relationships aren't there yet, start building them. And if you can and you have the capacity, start thinking about what those priority resources are going to be if you had major wildfire, major flood, and what personnel you might want to contact should something happen.
All right, well, thanks, Devin. I'll just grab another one from near the top of the queue, and I'll pick the second one on the list just because I think it might be something that we can get a different perspective on from each of the panelists. It's around monitoring and how are adaptive management and maintenance being integrated into the monitoring plan. So Mara, you were talking about at the regional scale, and then at a very local scale, Brenly and Devin, you were talking about it. Rachel, you were kind of talking about it at the watershed scale, but it's a common issue and a common need. So maybe I could at least start with a couple of you. Maybe I'll cycle back to you, Mara, in terms of monitoring. So at your regional scale, how is adaptive management and maintenance being integrated in to the restoration work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, the answer is it's just starting. So this area of the state, we have not had listed species under the Endangered Species Act, which means that historically we've had very little funding to do habitat restoration, and so there hasn't been much to monitor. That has changed I would say over the last 5 or 6 years. Definitely the sort of strategic thinking and planning has positioned us well to compete for new federal and state sources as they have come available, but also just I think there's an increasing realization in within the state funding that investing in the Washington coast and protecting what is some of the best remaining runs of salmon and steelhead is important. And so with that comes the responsibility to monitor. And so we are actually in process of developing a coastal region monitoring strategy at this point that will help us identify those priorities and monitoring, adaptive management, monitoring, evaluate, and respond would be part of that plan. But at the moment, there isn't really a formalized program in place.
And then, Rachel, we touched on this in some of the questions I put to you following your talk. So I'm not asking you to repeat that, but is there anything you'd want to add, in particular on the adaptive management component? to the monitoring as you're encountering it at the watershed scale?
I guess I would just add that, I like to say that restoration is a young science and we're still learning so much all the time. So just doing that, showing up at the table and paying attention to what others are learning and figuring out how to translate lessons learned from other projects to the work you're doing. And then I just want to sort of give a salute to some of our funders in Washington State who are actually starting to do a better job of funding ongoing stewardship and maintenance of riparian projects and other projects, realizing that that initial investment of getting work done and getting plants in the ground is great, but if we don't continue to invest in that property until it's starting to meet some of those restoration objectives, it's sort of like letting money run downstream, right? So we're starting to see a little bit of a shift in the understanding of funders in the value of ongoing monitoring and maintenance. I would say it feels a little it's one of those things that feels intimidating at a watershed scale, at a big watershed scale. Like, how do I, with my 6 people, get enough people out on the ground to monitor, long-term monitoring and maintenance? So this is a big part of my homework for the next, couple of years of the program, is figuring out how to better access some of the resources out there to ensure that we're producing good science. I'm one of those that is impatient for progress, so I tend to focus on the work on the ground. But it is really important and valuable that we make sure that we're learning from these projects, but trying to keep both those trains moving at once so we're not slowing down project work. The salmon just needs so much help as quickly as possible. So trying to find a balance between getting stuff done efficiently and effectively, as well as learning while we do it, is a constant challenge.
Thanks, Rachel. Devin, would you have a comment in terms of how adaptive management's factoring into your work?
Yeah, I would well, first echo Rachel's sentiments that funders are definitely starting to be more open to funding these projects longer term, with the recognition that monitoring is a key piece in going forward and determining the actual effectiveness of that research. But no, again, as Rachel said, restoration is a new science, so I think we're all sort of learning as to what that looks like. But really, it's buy-in from the funders and the groups involved in the project to carry on that monitoring piece, I think, is a big part of it, where oftentimes, you have consultants and parties that are off to the next project. Whereas from the community perspective at Skijiston here, we're not going anywhere. So we'll be here long term, and we do have an investment as to how these projects succeed and what that means for the community.
Thanks, Devin. And Brenly, I'll turn to you, and then Greer, I'll circle back to you at the end on the same question. But Brenly, I know your project's pretty new. I've had the chance to go with you to see that, so it's pretty neat to see your talk. You did a great job. But what are you thinking in terms of adaptive management and the monitoring for that work?
Yeah, I would just echo what others have said, that partnering with community groups that have a vested interest in the place will ensure long-term monitoring and just to have eyes on the ground, even if it's not official monitoring or for specific parameters, just to have some qualitative feedback is really helpful as well. But I mean, obviously, monitoring, especially when we're trying new things, is super important. Even if something has worked in another watershed, each watershed I find just there's so many nuances, and if it works somewhere else, it might not necessarily work here, and teasing out the why, I think will really advance restoration technique moving forward. It's adapting methods for different locations. And so, yeah, it's obviously important. It's just has to get done.
Well, Greer, I'll circle to you, and recognizing you work at a state level organization or entity, and do you have a perspective to add to that from that different kind of level or relativity to things?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I think it really depends on what scale you're looking at. And so I'm trying to think about long-term monitoring from different scales. There's so much technology to use remote sensing and satellite imagery to understand change at a landscape or state scale or even beyond that. And so we're trying to leverage those tools to create different ways of looking at landscape change. I think understanding the context of our restoration is a good starting place. We think we're doing a lot of good on the ground, but when you back up, we may be in a situation where losing habitat faster than we're able to recover it. So we need to understand those rates of change at the landscape scale or watershed scale. But we also need to understand how river systems are changing at the reach and the watershed or Huck 12 scale is a great way to look at things too. And so I think reach assessments, tributary assessments, different ways of getting boots on the ground alongside remote sensing can help us understand change. And then obviously it's only important if you sit down and talk about it and think about what prioritization tools or adaptation tools we have to modify what we're doing. So Mara presented such a great tool that we can use to make better decisions. And that's the only way we can leverage that monitoring data is if it's directly tied to a collaborative group of people making decisions over time. So both Rachel and Mara and Brenly and Devin all touched on some good examples of how you can leverage data and information and local collaboration to make better decisions. But I do think it starts with a good monitoring program that touches all different scales of how we implement watershed recovery.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to turn back to Laura for a next question.
Sure. Thanks, Jason. We've got a question that's highlighted on the top here. I think we can direct it kind of generally to the panel here, asking what role does restoring river processes have in ensuring that riparian plants can grow and thrive? So thinking specifically to the riparian zone, is it more of an issue of establishing plants that will create resilient functioning watersheds, or is it altering the stream flows to ensure a resilient functioning riparian zone? So a little bit of a nuanced of where to focus the efforts. Does anyone have an interest in taking a stab at that question?
I might jump in real quick. I think that both of those things are really important, particularly if we connect it to this morning's talk about heterogeneity and ensuring that we have habitat complexity in the riparian zone. So there's, places that cottonwoods are going to like, and some wetland areas that will have more wetland plants, and some higher zones for conifers, and ensuring that heterogeneity. But I do want to say that in the context of what I'm seeing, and this is even on fairly remote DNR managed lands, tributary systems, we do not underestimate the impact of dense monocultures of invasive species on riparian succession. And you could restore the heck out of the in-stream, structure and have a very heterogeneous, river system. But if you don't get in there and deal with the thick mat of reed canary grass that is preventing any riparian succession, then it's not always going to be effective. And the other thing that's been really eye-opening for me is going to places high up in the watershed, like the Middle Fork of the Snoqualmie River, that have very, very large, intact 300-foot, trees in the riparian zone, and no wood in the river. So, the logging all the way down to the river's edge that was done, and the subsequent impact on and the removal of large wood from the rivers for transport of wood and other things. Just because you have a recovered, 150-year-old forest on the riverbank doesn't mean that you instantly have big enough trees to stay in that system. So this is a remote system with big wood all around it, and still a very significant lack of in-stream complexity, and none of those logs are sticking and staying in the system. So one of the mentalities that we're trying to get is pretty much everywhere needs wood. So let's maybe bring the projects to where the wood is, instead of trying to bring the projects to the wood to the project. So that's kind of thinking more on places where we do have intact riparian forests. Don't assume that means that there isn't a need for restoration, or the in-stream habitat isn't struggling in other ways. But between the knotweed and the reed canary grass, dealing with those invasive species, don't underestimate the importance of that to get functioning riparian habitats.
Thank you. Yeah, those are two really important points. We haven't sort of directly head-on tackled the invasive question in this workshop, but that's so important, especially in some watersheds and most definitely in more sort of urban and semi-urban watersheds where invasives are so problematic and will really undermine any attempts to try to restore some healthy habitat unless you deal with them head-on. And then the wood load question, so important. I remember Ellen this morning making a comment that there's an estimated 200-year recovery time required to restore back to natural wood loads in the absence of any intervention or any, restoration of wood projects. So, like you say, it's so important to figure out how to most effectively boost those wood loads and accelerate recovery. I'd invite anyone else on the panel here to kind of work off of what Rachel's commented or brought to the table. Any thoughts that you have?
Sure, I can jump in. Going back to the question, I think that restoring river processes is about, and stream flows they're all kind of interconnected. And so I would agree with Rachel that it's both are equally important. And even just something as something like point bar outmigration, cottonwoods. This is very cottonwood specific, possibly, but cottonwoods, they like to colonize on the inside bends. And as the point bar grows out, the bars, the trees kind of that are in the back of the point bar kind of get more and more shielded by the river, so they get a chance to grow tall. And so in areas that are concised where the point bars are not allowed to expand out anymore, you don't have those mature trees, or at least those processes are inhibited. And so there's a lot of mechanisms that are all interconnected. And so it's hard to answer the question, is it the stream flow problem or is it a river processes problem? It's kind of a little bit of everything, and they kind of all impact one another.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. Anyone else on the panel who would like to add to this question here before we move on?
I think one thing I'll add is that we haven't talked about is I think it's not only wetting up floodplains and restoring process to support the establishment of vegetation, but it's also recruitment of vegetation. Some cases we've lost that process that recruits vegetation through disturbance. And so without that natural recruitment from riparian areas that would move down and revegetate areas downstream, we have to somehow recreate that. So in some cases, it might be, again, planting adjacent to the active channel that's inundated regularly, mimicking disturbance events in some way to allow that process to form. So that's just something else to think about. You may need stepping stones in your restoration in terms of developing riparian downstream and allowing that recruitment to sort of perpetuate itself.
Great. I'll pass it over to Jason to raise another question here.
Okay, well, the question at the top of our list, it's got a lot of votes, but I don't know what project it's referring to. So, Brenly, I'm assuming this is asking about your project, but to the person that posed this, if I'm reading it wrong, feel free to offer a clarification through the Slido. But Brenly, maybe turn to you in terms of what are the water license requirements for projects like the one that you were doing.
Yeah, so for this one, this is in BC. We needed a short-term use license from the province. It was, I don't know if this would be different coming from a different project partner, but as a government entity, it was fairly simple to apply for this license. We did need landowner support, which was Skeetchison. And so those were the two requirements, was the landowner support and also the short-term use permit. And I'm sure that depending on the volume of water that you're planning on drawing, it might affect your outcomes. So you kind of need to provide some details about why you're doing, how much water you need, and if you have the support from the necessary people.
Great. Thanks, Brenly. Laura, I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. We've got a question that's highlighted on top here. I'll put out to the panel. Do restoration practitioners feel supported by universities and other educational research centers? How can we make these connections more effective to bring these two sort of siloed work teams together? Any thoughts?
I think in my experience, in terms of researchers working with practitioners, because it is such a new science, they can often be one and the same. Usually there is some researcher involved in any kind of restoration work I've been involved with, even in the dead man. But there's certainly lots of opportunity there. I know in university itself, it's starting to become more common for restoration, whether terrestrial or in-stream riparian courses to be offered. I was fortunate to catch one in my last year of undergrad, but it was the first course to be offered at TRU for restoration work. But in terms of making those connections, I think, yeah, being involved in projects like this is obviously a great way to network between them. And there's often an enthusiastic response to support and collaborate between the two.
Oh, that's great to hear. That's great to hear. Rachel mentioned in her talk how restoration is really a very new science, and I think that does lend itself to more opportunity for interaction and integration among sort of a more academic and or practically based project teams. Does anyone else have thoughts to add there? Yeah, Rachel.
Yeah, Laura, I might say that, I don't have a lot of experience working with the research community, and it feels a little opaque to me. I'm not even sure sometimes how to go about it. So better transparency about who leads different labs at which schools and who's working on what topics, and just how to go about. Is it just a cold call to a professor to say, hey, are you interested? I don't, I think a lot of land managers particularly aren't used to working in that kind of a collaborative space. So a roadmap to what that would look like, and how to have those conversations would be really helpful. It's so that we can better share that information and start those conversations. I think there's a lot of opportunity in my program. I think it's a great space for fellowships and things like that, because it's a very diverse body of work. So an awesome opportunity for young professionals to do a little bit of salmon monitoring, and a little bit of landscape planning, and a little bit of land management, and really get to try their hands at a bunch of different natural resource types of work, and figure out where they want to go next. So I think I mentioned I'm going to be spending some more time kind of unpacking that part of the work in the future. And because when you're really focused on getting projects on the ground, it's hard to add in this research piece as much as you might want to. It feels like it's a want to have, not a must have, right? So making it easier to climb that hill would be really great.
Comments. I'm gonna pass it. Well, okay. I think was that Mara that you'd like to add in? I'm also going to bring Greer into the conversation with her role at GSRO. But go ahead, Mara.
Yeah, would like to offer a few thoughts here. I don't think the divide there or the silo is so much about like the science. I think there's a lot of really good publications about restoration techniques and what works and what doesn't. How we should think about process-based restoration. I think that the gap is the time and ability to translate between mindsets that are really focused on research and understanding processes and how things work, and the application and practitioner in the field who is working to get the projects done on the ground, and how people with the skill to translate between those two, and the time to make those translations, to me, is the biggest chasm between the academic and university research and the practitioner doing the work on the ground.
Well, thanks. I'm curious to pass this over to Greer with her role as science coordinator at the GSRO. If this falls a bit into your sort of work plan, or if you've got some thoughts on how to, kind of bridge that chasm that Mara refers to.
Yeah, I think there's some key partners, and each watershed is different. How engaged the research community is in a watershed and with the partners. I think tribes and tribal organizations are a huge part of our partnership on science and generating results and getting those results into decision making, as are our federal and state agencies. So I think it just takes time, and Mara's right on. I think there is this huge gap sometimes between the research and the application. And so the more people that are working in that space, which some of us are on this call and in this workshop today. And so, I don't have an answer to that besides I really want to get more funding out there and resources to have that type of collaboration. We have funding for implementing the restoration work, but there is, as Rachel and others have mentioned, there's a lack of funding and support for capacity at that level of bridging the science into tools that can directly impact decision making. And I really want to push into that space, especially as it relates to watershed recovery.
Is there any other thoughts from the panel before we move on to another question?
It seems like a really right place to have a workshop that just gets some researchers and practitioners in the room together to just figure out where there's overlap, that maybe a lot could happen in 3 hours of, being in the same place at the same time. So little plug for those of you who are in the space of convening workshops. This could be a good one for the future.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Rachel. We will we'll make a note of that for sure. I'll pass it back to Jason to pose another question.
Rachel, I've got one that I've been kind of keeping in my my ledger here, and I'll start it with you, but I'll invite others from the panel to offer their perspective on it. And if I followed kind of the middle segment of your talk, you were describing your initiative. 5 goals, 34 outcomes, 115 implementation actions. But in the scheme of advancing that, are some of them clearly more important than others, or going to make more of a difference than others in terms of outcomes for fish or outcomes for salmon? Or is it they're all on the list and we'll just pick whichever one is ready to go next? Because I'm thinking about how do we get and continue to build this bridge between the strategic view on watershed-based, process-based recovery, and linking it to, okay, that makes sense in theory, but what are we actually going to do tomorrow? And so I'm intrigued by the action orientation that you have, and I think I share your kind of instinct to try to do more sooner. But in doing that, how do you try to steer towards things are going to make the biggest difference versus just doing the next thing that I can do the soonest?
Well, I think that the shortest answer in that is, if you're going to start picking apples, you're going to pick the lowest hanging fruit first, right? So you certainly figure out, and for us, because we're relatively new in this space, and I'm sort of trying to bring along the land managers and the decision makers at the agency with us, that yes, this is a space where we have an important role to play. It had to be both the projects that seemed like we could demonstrate some early successes and ensure that the legislature would see that this investment was resulting in some impact that was clearly visible after just a couple of years, as well as where was it clearly our role to show up and do this, and where was this clearly DNR's space. So the knotweed one, I keep coming back to that, is a really good example of that. A lot of the knotweed that is plaguing our rivers is on state-owned aquatic lands. And we just haven't had the capacity or the resources to address it systematically, but it's clearly our role as land manager to steward our lands and deal with things like invasive species that are becoming a problem and threatening salmon recovery. So those just were sort of the low-hanging fruit. And that's why I zeroed in on DNR managed lands. Like, do our lands overlap with priority subbasins for salmon recovery? That's clearly a space where we should be showing up. I think there's been this mentality for a long time at the state that we don't do stuff ourselves. We support partners in doing it. So this is about us trying to show up to do more projects ourselves. So I think you have to start with, what is going to be easy, which boulder is going to be easier to get rolling, right? And then RAP by nature was a very aspirational plan. Some of the metrics are, frankly, not as SMART as in, attainable and measurable and that nice little project management lingo that we all use as we would like. So there's certainly some things that felt like they were wandering a little too far outside of DNR's jurisdiction. Yes, they are important, but maybe the way that we implement that is by writing letters of support and, providing a lift for partners who are more able to do that work. So, I can't do 112 implementation actions at once. So, and a lot of it is being done elsewhere at the agency. So it's focusing in on what we don't have capacity to do and finding that low hanging, nice, big, ripe, juicy apple, starting with that. So you can make an apple pie for your funders and say, look at what we've done, and start to build that momentum and build a story of impact and success. So that's how I sort of dove into it and zeroed in. And then plus, I got a restoration bias. That's my background. I know how to do that. Right. So that's sort of where we zeroed in on, is where can we implement projects on the ground that start to address this and start thinking about how they work together.
So, Mara, I'd like to just follow up on that thread with you, thinking about kind of the same question that I posed to Rachel, but through the lens of the Climate Resilience Index, which seems to go through an exercise of parameters and then try to choose the ones that seem to be most, I'll call them pressing, that's my word, or most impactful in the different watersheds that are within your region. And so is that process taking you towards, out of these suite of things that probably all would be good to do, but which ones might make the biggest difference or have the best payoff? Is the Climate Resilience Index kind of approach, do you think it's taking you there?
So that was the intent of that sensitivity analysis was, hey, here's these 22 metrics that we've all kind of agreed contribute to the climate resilience of salmon and their habitats in these watersheds, but which ones are having the greatest influence on resilience? And so that was the point there of doing that analysis, was to try to help our folks who are working on the ground focus in on what specifically could they do to have the greatest impact. We're always trying to think of, the biggest bang for the buck kind of a thing, right? And so that was definitely the intent. And what we steered away from was, only do your work in the watersheds that have the highest resilience scores. And that was really a big topic of conversation. And ultimately, there is very little that we see about these future projections that suggests to us that any of these areas are completely off limit. It's more, what do we do in the particular areas of interest to add climate resilience to the restoration efforts that are occurring?
That's great. I appreciate that perspective. Again, it's one of those things I think I could explore all afternoon with you, but we're getting close to our time here, so I'm going to turn back to Laura to let you either take a question or steer us towards wrap up.
Sure, thanks, Jason. Yeah, in recognizing the time, it's been a very full day of tremendous learning and knowledge sharing. Thought we could sort of wrap up the workshop by posing to each speaker on our panelists today, including Greer, if you've just got some closing thoughts or some inspirational thoughts, guidance, insights that you'd like to share with our virtual audience to close out the workshop. So Mara, since we had a conversation there going between you and Jason, if you don't mind, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think for me, listening this afternoon and this morning, and it was one of the things that really stood out to me was how this all comes together. I think that, Rachel kind of laid out leaning into, or I don't know if she did this explicitly, but what I wrote down was leaning into our individual expertise and authorities and responsibilities. Devin kind of pointed out that they were ready to respond to the sort of huge disturbances in the watershed because they had these existing relationships. And just when we're talking about a watershed scale resilience, we're talking about relationships and collaborations among people, making it work, as much as we are identifying the highest priority needs. Like, they're both important, but there's sort of a undercurrent theme today about the importance of relationships and the importance of everybody bringing their own skills and expertise to the party. That is what will make this work. So maybe that was my takeaway today.
Yeah, thank you, Mara. I think that's a great summation of kind of a strategy going forward. Rachel, some closing thoughts.
I think that I am always struck by the similarities among the differences, to see where Devin and Brenly are working in this really dry and arid system, but it's the same things, floodplain connection, incision, and hearing Ellen Wool speak this morning about, these things are basically in common with almost all river systems. And I think that's a good reminder to me, because sometimes I can be dismissive of science that comes out of a dry mountain river, because I feel like it's not as applicable to where I'm working. And so it's a good reminder that there's a lot that we have in common with the challenges that we're facing across the landscape, and a lot that we can learn from each other. So I think that was one takeaway, and just it always makes me so hopeful when you realize that we're all a cog in a big machine of people trying to push the planet forward, and because you can just feel like the work is just so unsurmountable sometimes. So it's always a good reminder that there's lots of good work happening around our region.
Wonderful, Rachel. Yeah, I share your positive mindset there. That's great. Devin, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'd just like to say it's great to see all the other projects and learn from each other on our successes and what we might do different next time. Very, very interested in both Mara and Rachel's kind of breakdown of the watersheds and how they manage that piece by piece, and you can scale up and scale down based on what attributes you're looking at. Definitely something we're looking to do here. I did mention we had such quick response to the Sparks Lake fire after it was declared out in 2021, largely in part to the fact that we had been through something similar in 2017 with Elephant Hill wildfire on the west portion of the reserve. And that was, Sparks Lake was 90,000, Elephant Hill was 170,000 hectares, so even larger to deal with. So while we weren't as directly involved in that project, we still, had enough learnings from others going through that sort of process that we knew what we had to do for Sparks Lake. But in terms of other communities that might be in similar situations, like I said, having those working relationships in place is key, and knowing what you want to protect or manage going forward and who that's going to require to be brought in is essential. But really, ultimately, as I said earlier, all referrals for work are coming into their community's band office already. All we had to do is put our hand up and say, hey, we want to coordinate this, we want to be involved, and we want to be directing what's going on out there. And with those relationships in place, it fell into place. But it's going to be different for everybody based on the situation. But if, as Mara said, if there's people there willing to work together towards the objective set, then you can make things happen.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Devin. And Brenly, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I guess as a kind of a practitioner myself, I really appreciated learning about all the tools that are being developed out there. And I really appreciate the, expansions on how those tools can be applied on the ground level. And so I think there's a lot of new tools coming out. I would love to have the opportunity to sort of follow these over time and see, as you roll out into the implementation phase, what are the kinks, what are the challenges? I mean, similarly, like for my project, you know, we just did one site out of hopefully many along a corridor. And so the ability to maybe just to if there's a way to, you know, follow up with one another to see how it actually rolls out over time, I think that would be really interesting and helpful.
All right, thanks, Brenly. And Greer, we'll close. We'll finish up with you with your comments. You've been so instrumental in helping to bring this workshop together, and it's just such a thoughtful and very holistic perspective to this. So yeah, if you've got some closing thoughts.
Thanks, Laura. I'll be brief. I just really want to say thank you to everyone who presented and shared their thoughts today. It's been such an informative and hopeful message throughout the day. You know, I walk away really thinking about how important it is to set the table and get the right people at the table to really do the hard work it's going to take to do this. There's some workhorses that need to be present, and whoever sets that table, whatever leader it is, I think what we saw today is it doesn't really matter who it is or what their motivation is. It's just about stepping up and taking on that role. And then there's key elements to the process that we heard about, obviously adaptive management and tied to decision making, informed by good science and long-term monitoring, and systems thinking in terms of how we envision the future of any watershed and how we're going to get there. And I think there's great opportunities for collaboration in this space that we don't often have in salmon recovery. You know, this work touches wildlife. Our riparian areas and watershed function are incredibly important to wildlife recovery and sustainability, and human values like flood risk attenuation and water availability. We need to really strategize on how we take advantage of those human values that we're providing through our work. And then it's not only about the work we're doing, but how we communicate that outside that table and build support and really hone in on what we're doing and why it's important to all those different entities and wildlife and fish species. So that's what I walked away with, but it was just such great conversation. So thank you, Jason and Laura, for working with me on this today. It's been great.
Yeah, oh, thank you, Greer. And thank you to all our panelists. It's been just a pleasure to hear about your incredible and inspiring work. And we thank you for sharing your knowledge and insights with our virtual audience today. It's much appreciated. So for those online, I'm just going to queue up my tech team, if they could just bring up a couple last slides. Yeah, thank you. Just as a reminder that all past workshops are hosted on the PSF website, and this workshop and its recordings and supplementary materials will all be up there in the coming weeks. I'd also just like to remind you that we've got a workshop survey that I'd love to get your feedback on. And so we've got a QR code here. But as a registrant of the workshop, you'll get an email from me a couple days from now with this link. So don't worry if you don't got the QR code working on your device right now. I'll send that to you as well. And a final plug that we've got our next workshop queued up for February 13th, 2025. So save the date and expect a registration link to come early in the new year. And with that, Jason and I just thanks everybody so much for tuning in today, for participating, and for having the interest in this important topic. So we wish you a great day, and thanks everybody.